Welcome to another adventure. This time around we find ourselves at Mount Vernon, George Washington's home. This was a real neat display at the main entry center as you come into the estate. It's basically a scaled down exact replica of the Mount Vernon mansion. Quite impressive with all the details on it. So Mount Vernon was actually called Little Hunting Creek Plantation. It was acquired by the Washington family around 1674 and first owned by John Washington, who was the great-grandfather to George Washington. From John it was passed to his son Lawrence Washington, and then on to Lawrence's daughter Mildred. In 1726, Mildred's brother Augustine, George Washington's George Washington's father, purchased the estate and built the main part of the plantation house. In 1740, Augustine passed the estate to his eldest son, Lawrence, which was George's half-brother. It's when Lawrence had it that it was named after a famous naval officer, Admiral Edward Vernon, hence Vernon Estate, or Mount Vernon. George Washington inherited the plantation after the death of Lawrence in 1754, and Lawrence's two heirs, his daughter Sarah, who died in 1754, and his widow Anne, who died in 1761. George actually lived with his half-brother for much of his childhood and was living in the property back in the 1750s. In 1753, George Washington actually started his military career. George Washington actually renovated the house several times over 4 decades. First time was in 1758, and the second time was in 1770. When he started the project in 1770, that was delayed because of the Revolutionary War, so it wasn't finished for several years. But that renovation is what you see today when you visit Mount Vernon. Out of all these buildings, there are 20 original structures that were here when George Washington was here. Some of them have been rebuilt replicas to show what life would have been like in the 1700s. It's just amazing how much of this is actual original buildings that were there when George Washington was here. It's also really neat to see how long it had been in the Washington family. Part of the original structures is this brick fence. This fence was really neat. Loved the shape of it. Quite an extensive job to build this entire fence, but that is the original fence around the estate. And of course there were several gardens. Some of them were close to the house, like this one, so that the cooks could go out and gather what was needed from the garden. Paint was expensive back then. You didn't just get rid of it, so they actually had to store it in a more temperature-controlled environment. That's why it's more like a root cellar. Lots of informative plaques up to give you more details to what you're looking at. And to an extent, this is also a living history museum. There are people dressed in period garb that help you in your tour, answer questions, and give you information that may not be on those information boards. Kind of wish the blacksmith shop would have been functioning while we were there. That would have been really neat. And this is one of the slave quarters that were on site. This is the greenhouse. It was kind of interesting that there are 2 fireplaces that could be burned in during the wintertime, and they were just on the other side of a brick wall from the main greenhouse room, so they could heat the greenhouse in the wintertime so they could keep tropical plants. If I recall correctly, they had lemons and limes and orange trees that they could keep in the greenhouse during the winter times, and as long as those fires were kept burning, the greenhouse would stay warm enough. And of course, this is the main house. The main house is 11,028 square feet with 21 rooms. So a little on the big side. And this is the original house. What I found interesting is you look at the wall there and it looks like stone, but it's not. Stone back then would have been very, very expensive. See, these are wood planks beveled on the ends to look like stone and placed on the side so they look like stacked stone. And then while the paint is still wet, they put sand on it to give it that rock-like look to it. And it's just something they did back in those times to make it look like stone when you couldn't afford it. How would you like to have that for your view off your back deck? Then on to the Marine Corps Museum. This one was special to me. I joined the Marine Corps back in the 80s, so I've got some history with the great organization. The building there, it was designed by an architect to kind of resemble the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima, which once it's explained to you, you can kind of see where the main roof of the building design comes from. I worked in the 3rd Marine Air Wing, so I was around aircraft. The Huey, the Cobra, the OV-10 Bronco, the Harrier, and that's the Harrier right there, the FA-18 Hornet, several other aircraft. Going through the basic training section sure brought back a lot of memories. Even though it's been as long as it has been, I can still hear the drill instructor yelling to get off his bus, get on those footprints. And oh boy, did your world change when you got off that bus. From haircuts to all new clothing to strict training, learning how to march in formation, learning to work as a team. It's been a long time, but it's stuff I will not forget. So the Marines were actually founded November 10th, 1775 in Tun Tavern. Their primary goal initially was to be attached with the Navy, and they would sit up in the crow's nest in the ships and fire at enemy ships from up there with their rifles, and also assist with landings or embarking on other ships to take them over. And of course, the amount of different operations they took on throughout the decades and centuries since then have continually grown the Marine Corps into what it is today. Having my own personal experience with the Marine Corps, I knew the history. But going through this and seeing some of the old uniforms and the old weapons, it's just interesting to see the changes and differences from when they started back in the late 1700s to when I was in there in the 1900s. Quite a big difference. This is actually one of the sledgehammers used by the Marines that took on John Brown at John Brown's Fort in Harper's Ferry, which is in one of our previous videos. It's always neat to see these little bits of evidence and actual articles in some of the historic places we'd already been to. Marine Corps has a long and storied history. From the Revolutionary War, the quasi-war with France, it had operations against Barbary pirates along the shores of Tripoli. They were an integral part to the Mexican War, 1846-48. They fought to the halls of Montezuma in Mexico City. Civil War, most of their duty was with the Navy, of course, in blockades and some amphibious landings in those areas, though one battalion was involved in and fought at Bull Run. From the Spanish-American War, the Philippine Insurrection, the Boxer Rebellion. They earned the title Devil Dogs in World War I, 1918, during the Battle of Belleau Wood. It was definitely neat to walk through this and see the progression of uniforms, equipment, supplies, what they were involved in. Being a part of the 3rd Marine Air Wing, it was cool to see some of the really old aviation equipment and units that were there. It's amazing to think that Marine Corps aviation dates back to 1912. I also found it very Marine Corps-like that we've been to so many different places with cannons and other Civil War or that era type munitions and equipment. And you come into the Marine Corps Museum and the cannons are highly shined and very, very clean and detailed. That's definitely a Marine Corps thing. There were days that my sergeants and command staff would have us out shining brass fittings in the engine compartments of the vehicles we drove. Everything had to be just so. Seeing a lot of the old advertisements for people to enlist or just support the military during World War I, World War II, Korea, a lot of those things. It was just really neat to see the old artifacts like that. And they have the museum broke down into different areas. You first go through the boot camp area, but then as you walk through the museum, it starts from back 1700s Revolutionary War, works its way through each main battle and gives you good artifacts, lots of information that you can look at and see how things changed over the years and progressed through the decades. And it's really neat to see some of the original artifacts, like flags that flew over islands or forts, or that had a lot of historic significance. Having the actual flag there on display was just amazing. Had a lot of dioramas that showed crews and equipment, and just a whole lot of good information and real detailed history of the Marine Corps. I'm a little biased being a Marine myself, but if you're in the area, I would strongly suggest going and checking this out. Definitely worth a trip in my mind. They were doing some upgrades at the time, so some of the historical areas were closed off, and it just so happened to be one of the areas that was closed off happened to be the 1980s, 90s, which, of course, being in myself and being involved in Desert Storm, I was kind of looking forward to seeing that, but that area was closed for the renovations they were doing, so we were unable to see it. But the rest of the museum was top-notch. Really enjoyed it. It's a neat experience taking my wife through that, showing her a lot of these displays, and especially the boot camp area and some of the stuff I had been involved in when I was in. This is kind of a neat display that kind of give you an idea of what it was like unloading from what I think is a CH-46 helicopter. In my time in the Marine Corps, that's similar to what a CH-46 looks like, even though I don't think that is what this is. This was an earlier version. What it would have been like unloading into a military outpost. Yeah, that's the style of desert camis I wore. Definitely some heart-wrenching displays in there that really make you think about the sacrifices made by our brave military. This was definitely a little more uplifting. That's just some of the awards that the President's own, the Marine Corps Band, has won over the years. And this was neat in the gift shop. I don't know how long it took this gentleman to build this, but that is The flag raising at Iwo Jima out of Legos. Pretty darn impressive. That's a lot of Legos.